Okay, so like when you really start thinking about things, you get to those big, like really big questions, like what is there? Like what actually exists? And then what's it like? Like what's the nature of reality?
Right, the fundamental stuff.
Yeah. And today we're diving into someone who offered like some really detailed, meticulously crafted answers to those questions. We're
Yeah.
talking about David Lewis, one of the heavy hitters of 20th century philosophy. And to guide our deep dive today, we've got the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on his Metaphysics.
Sounds good.
Yeah. And I think our mission today is to really unpack the core of his system.
Yeah.
Like his really fundamental take on what reality is, his ideas about possibility, which were pretty game-changing, and then how he kind of tries to build everything else on top of that foundation.
Absolutely. I mean, it's an ambitious project.
Huge, huge project. And we'll also, because we're being good philosophers here, we'll look at some of the sticking points that other philosophers have raised about Lewis's views. So really think of this, for you listening, as a structured exploration of a really, really ambitious and systematic philosophical worldview.
Perfect.
Yeah, and tailored for you, since you're already into philosophy.
I mean, Lewis, he tackled like such a huge range of philosophical issues, right?
Mhm.
From language to logic to the mind. He was everywhere. But, I think it's fair to say that his metaphysical framework underpins so much of his work.
Mm.
And the SF entry, they really hit the nail on the head when they point out that, like, if you really want to understand the Lewisian way of thinking, you got to start with the metaphysics.
Yeah.
It's the foundation.
Totally. And it wasn't just, a side interest for him, right? It
Well,
was like central.
Absolute.
And the entry describes, his metaphysical positions as not only original, but like really, really strongly argued. Plus, the whole thing is presented as this incredibly coherent and interconnected system of thought.
That's one of the things that's so striking about Lewis, right? It's not just one idea here and one idea there.
Yeah.
It's this remarkable internal consistency, the coherence. And I think most crucially, what the SAP highlights is how his metaphysical views really acted as a kind of like a filter for the rest of his philosophy.
Yeah.
Like if he came across an idea in, say, ethics, and it didn't fit within his fundamental picture of reality, he was willing to reconsider it or even discard it.
Yeah. Wow. Like almost like if it doesn't fit with my fundamental picture of reality, I'm changing reality.
Almost, yeah, he has this strong commitment to systematicity.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
everything has to fit together.
Okay, so let's get into this picture, his picture of reality. Now, someone might hear about Lewis and his foundational metaphysics, and, you might imagine him starting with these kind of grand abstract principles and then, like, deducing everything else from them, right? Like a top-down system.
Yeah, I could see that.
But the SEPI entry makes it clear that that wasn't Lewis's approach at all.
Yeah, that's a common misconception about his methodology, and the entry does a good job correcting that. It wasn't top-down axiomatic. Instead, Lewis was all about what he called total reflective equilibrium.
Okay, that sounds fancy.
Yeah, it's a mouthful, but it's basically a more holistic approach. You start with your existing beliefs, whether it's common sense, scientific theories, or philosophical intuitions, and you kind of try to adjust them, tweak them to create the most coherent picture overall.
Okay, so it's less about starting with like a few absolute unshakable truths and more about figuring out how all of our different beliefs can like hang together in the best way possible, right?
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot, that overall coherence. The entry even quotes Lewis on this. He says, and I love this quote, "One comes to philosophy already endowed with a stock of opinions."
Right. We all come to the table with something.
Exactly. It is not the business of philosophy either to undermine or to justify these pre-existing opinions, he continues, to any great extent, but only to try to discover ways of expanding them into an orderly system.
I like that. Expanding them into an orderly system. So it's like it's not about throwing everything out and starting from scratch. It's about taking what we've got and, like tidying it up.
Yeah, exactly. And, I think that quote really gets to the heart of Lewis's method. It's about systematization. It's about striving for the greatest possible coherence within our belief system.
Okay, so that's the method.
Right.
Now let's get to the content. What is it that he's trying to systematize?
Sure. So the SEP entry, it points out that for understanding Lewis's system, it makes sense to present it in a structured way. Even though his method was holistic, we'll kind of go bottom up.
Okay, so we're going to start with the fundamentals.
Exactly.
And then build up to the more complex stuff.
Right.
So what are the main pillars of the system?
So there are three key components to Lewis's metaphysical program. The first is his account of the fundamental ontological structure of reality, like what actually exists at the most basic level.
Hmm.
And then the second is his theory of modality. This is his really famous realism about possible worlds.
Oh yeah, that's a big one.
Huge.
Yeah.
And then the third component is his attempt to explain all the other facts, like causation, the laws of nature, consciousness, everything, in terms of those first two components.
Okay, so we've got the fundamental structure of reality, we've got possible worlds, and then we've got, everything else.
Right. And interestingly, the C points out that the second component, his theory of modality, actually reduces to the first
Oh, interesting.
because he wants to explain possibility and necessity without relying on any unanalyzed primitive modal notions.
Okay, so it all kind of comes back to that fundamental ontology.
Yeah, it does. It all hinges on getting that first part right.
All right, well, let's talk about that then.
Sure.
Now, the traditional way philosophers have approached metaphysics, as the SAP reminds us, is through two big questions, which we've kind of already alluded to.
Right.
What is there, and what is it, whatever it is like? And, Lewis was very much in this tradition.
Absolutely.
Mm.
He viewed metaphysics as this fundamentally factual inquiry. It's not just about conceptual analysis. It's not just playing with words. It's about the way the world actually is.
Right. So, like, if two metaphysicians disagree about, let's say the existence of God or the nature of universals, they're not just having a disagreement about, how to use words or whose conceptual scheme is better. Like,
Right.
at least one of them, and maybe both, are making an actual factual error about the world.
Yeah, that's how Lewis saw it. He famously said, if you say flatly that there is no God, and I say that there are countless gods, but none of them are our world mates, then it may be that neither of us is making any mistake of method. But one of us, at least, is making a mistake of fact. Which one is wrong depends on what there is.
Wow. So no room for relativism there.
Not in Lewis's metaphysics.
Okay, so we've got this idea of what is there and what is it like. Now, within this realm of what exists and what it's like, Lewis distinguishes between what he calls the fundamental and the non-fundamental, right?
That's crucial.
And this is a key distinction for us as philosophers. So can you unpack that a bit? Like, what does he mean by that?
Yeah, sure. So think about like everyday objects, like a table, a chair, the laptop in front of you.
Yeah, sure.
Lewis would say that those things exist, of course, but they're not like fundamental components of reality. Their existence and their properties can be explained in terms of more basic entities, like maybe the elementary particles that make them up, right? So the chair is real, but it's not fundamental in the same way that maybe an electron or a quark is.
Right. Okay.
And similarly, a chair might have the property of being brown, but that's not a fundamental property in the same way that, say, having a certain spin or charge might be for a fundamental particle.
Right.
So Lewis really believed that some properties and relations are just objectively more fundamental than others. He called these the more natural properties and relations. And he thought that these natural properties and relations kind of reflect the deep structure of reality itself.
Okay, so we've got fundamental entities and fundamental properties. What about like fundamental relations, like how things relate to each other?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Lewis thought those were fundamental too. Like, think about the relationship of being spatially next to or being temporally before. Those kinds of relations seem very fundamental, like they're part of the basic fabric of reality.
Right, it makes sense. So we've got these three categories of fundamental stuff, and then everything else kind of gets built on top of that.
Exactly.
Okay, so how do we figure out what these fundamental entities, properties, and relations actually are? Like, is it just a matter of, doing more and more scientific experiments?
That's a great question, and it kind of gets to the heart of Lewis's methodology. The Seppi entry actually points out that Lewis thought the main path to understanding fundamental ontology is through a priori philosophical inquiry.
Oh, interesting. So not just through empirical science.
Not exclusively, no. He thought it was primarily through reasoning, through conceptual analysis, through, trying to build a coherent philosophical system.
Okay, but I'm guessing empirical findings still play a role.
Oh, yeah, they do.
Yeah.
And the entry promises to elaborate on that connection later on.
All right, looking forward to that. So we've got this basic framework of fundamental ontology, but it's still pretty abstract, right?
It is.
So to help us grasp it a bit better, the Seppi introduces this idea of the almost Lewis view.
Right.
So what is that, and why do we need it?
So the almost Lewis view is basically a simplified, kind of more opinionated version of Lewis's actual position.
Okay.
And it's super useful because it allows us to get the core tenets of his framework without getting bogged down in all the qualifications and subtleties of his mature view. It's like a stepping stone.
I like it. A stepping stone to Lewis.
Exactly.
All right, so what's on this stepping stone? What are the key claims of almost Lewis?
Okay, so there are three main claims.
Mm-hmm.
First, Almost Lewis says that the only fundamental particulars are space-time points.
Space-time points. Okay.
Yeah, so like the very locations in the fabric of space and time.
Oh, okay.
That's it. That's all there is at the fundamental level. And the second claim is that everything about these space-time points, their fundamental character, is determined by the perfectly natural monadic properties they have and the perfectly natural relations they hold to each other.
Okay, so their properties and their relationships. And what's a monadic property, by the way? Just to for those of us who need a refresher.
Oh, sure. A monadic property is just a property that applies to a single thing, like being red or being round or having a certain mass.
Got it. Okay, so space-time points, they have their properties, they have their relations. And what's the third claim?
The third claim is that all other facts, like literally every other fact, including facts about possibility and necessity,
Mm-hmm.
are determined by these fundamental facts about space-time points and the distribution of natural properties and relations across them.
Wow, okay. So like even like really big things, like whether, a coin flip comes up heads or tails, or whether I could have had, a different career path,
Yeah.
that all boils down to like what's happening at these space-time points.
That's the claim of Almost Lewis.
It's a bold claim.
Very bold.
Okay, so we've got this picture of, space-time points as being fundamental. But what about, everyday objects?
Yeah, like this laptop.
Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
Or, the trees outside my window or my cat. Like, where do those fit in?
Right. So it's important to remember that Almost Lewis, just like Lewis himself, believes those things exist.
Okay, good.
But the idea is that their existence and all their properties need to be explained in terms of these underlying fundamental entities and their arrangement.
Okay, so they're real, but they're kind of like emergent from the fundamental stuff.
Exactly.
Okay.
So, for example, Almost Lewis would say that this laptop has a mass of, 2 kilograms. Not because being 2 kilograms is a perfectly natural property that the laptop itself has at the fundamental level, but because it's composed of a bunch of fundamental parts whose intrinsic properties and relations to each other somehow give rise to that macroscopic property.
Okay, so the laptop's mass is kind of like a sum of its parts, but it's not a fundamental property in and of itself.
Right.
Okay. This almost Lewis view, it's a simplification, but it's already raised some really deep philosophical questions.
Oh, yeah.
And the essay outlines 4 key questions
Okay.
that need more examination. So let's go through them. The first one, and I think this is really the crux of the matter for us as philosophers, is what exactly are these perfectly natural properties and relations? Like, what makes them so special?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
Because if the whole picture of fundamental ontology depends on these natural properties and relations, then we better have a good grip on what makes them natural in the first place.
Right.
The SF reminds us that, like, when you're articulating a fundamental ontology, you need to do 2 things. You need to say what is fundamentally there, and then you need to say what its intrinsic nature is. And you do that by stating facts about those entities.
Okay.
But not just any old fact will do. So, like, the fact that a fundamental particle happens to be near a particular cloud, for instance, that doesn't seem to be part of its fundamental character.
Right. That just seems like a contingent fact.
Exactly. So the perfectly natural properties and relations, these are the ones that really carve reality at its joints.
Okay.
They're the ones that constitute the fundamental structure of the world, as the SAP entry puts it.
All right. So how do we define them? Like, what is it that makes a property or a relation perfectly natural?
So this is where the philosophical debate really takes off. The set points out that Lewis was a committed Platonist about sets.
Okay.
He believed in sets, right? And he thought that properties correspond to all sorts of predicates like is green, or even weird ones like is grew.
Grew. That's a classic philosophy example. Remind us what grew means.
Yeah, so grew is this made-up predicate. It means green if observed before a certain time and blue otherwise.
Okay.
So for Lewis, all of these properties, even the weird ones like grew, are just sets of actual and possible objects.
Okay.
So the real philosophical challenge is figuring out how to distinguish the perfectly natural sets from all the other sets.
Right, because there are a lot of possible sets.
Tons.
Yeah.
So what makes some sets reflect the fundamental structure of reality, while others are just kind of arbitrary groupings?
Right. Okay, so the CEPI outlines 4 broad philosophical approaches to this problem. What are they?
Okay, so the first one is based on the theory of universals,
Universal thing.
particularly as articulated by philosophers like Armstrong. The basic idea here is that a property, understood as a set of objects, is perfectly natural if and only if all of its members share a single, genuine universal.
Okay, so what's a universal in this context?
So a universal is kind of like a mind-independent entity that is wholly present in each of its instances. So like redness, if it's a universal, there's this one thing, redness, that exists in all red things.
Okay.
The Cephi actually quotes Armstrong here. He says, we could call a property, a set of actual and possible objects, perfectly natural if its members are all and only those things that share some one universal.
Okay, so that's one way to ground naturalness
Yeah.
in these universals. But was Lewis on board with that view?
Interestingly, he was initially sympathetic to it, but he later came to reject it.
Okay.
So that's the first approach. What else is there?
Yeah, what are the other options?
Okay, so the second possibility is it's a bit more straightforward. It's a more nominalist approach. You just take natural as a primitive predicate.
Okay.
It applies to certain sets of objects, and that's it. So some sets are just fundamentally natural, some are less so, most are not at all, and there's no further explanation.
Okay, so we just kind of accept that natural is like a basic undefined concept.
Right. The Cephi quotes Lewis on this, saying that a nominalist could take it as a primitive fact that some classes of things are perfectly natural properties.
Okay, so that's option 2. What about option 3?
So option 3 is to define natural in terms of a primitive notion of objective resemblance.
Okay, resemblance.
So the idea is that perfectly natural properties are those whose instances resemble each other in fundamental objective ways.
Okay.
And they don't resemble things that don't have that property.
Right.
So like all red things resemble each other in a way that they don't resemble blue things.
Right.
And that resemblance, if it's fundamental and objective, that's what makes red a natural property.
Okay, so it's all about similarity.
Exactly. The Cephi quotes Lewis again. He says, alternatively, a nominalist in pursuit of adequacy might prefer to rest with primitive objective resemblance among things. Then he could undertake to define natural properties in terms of the mutual resemblance of their members and the failure of resemblance between their members and their non-members.
So that's option 3. And what about number 4?
All right, so the fourth possibility mentioned is an ontology of tropes.
Tropes. Okay, remind us what tropes are again.
Sure. So tropes are these particularized property instances. So like the specific redness of this apple
Okay.
or the specific mass of that electron.
Okay, so it's not redness in general, it's the redness of this particular apple.
Exactly. So instead of universals or sets of objects, the fundamental building blocks of reality might be these individual instances of properties.
Okay, so we're going even more granular.
Right. And the SF mentions a bunch of thinkers who have defended something like this view. Lewis himself in his 1986 book, Williams, Campbell, they've all explored these ideas.
Okay, so 4 different ways to try and pin down what perfectly natural means.
Right.
Now, regardless of which one almost Lewis, or Lewis himself for that matter, might favor, the essay mentions 4 constraints that any adequate theory of natural properties and relations should satisfy. Like 4 criteria that any account has to meet to be taken seriously. So what are these constraints?
All right, so the first constraint is minimality.
Minimality, okay.
The idea here is that we shouldn't posit more perfectly natural properties and relations than we absolutely need.
Right, keep it simple.
Exactly. We want a fundamental basis that's just powerful enough to explain everything, but without any unnecessary extras. As this SE quotes Lewis, the guiding idea, roughly, is that the world's universals should comprise a minimal basis for characterizing the world completely.
Makes sense. Okay, that's minimality. What's the second constraint?
The second constraint is non-modality.
Non-modality, okay.
And this one can be a bit tricky to wrap your head around. But the basic idea is that whether a particular has a certain natural property or whether some particular stand in a certain natural relation, that shouldn't place any logical or metaphysical constraints on what other properties or relations those particulars or any other particulars could have.
Okay, so it's like the fundamental building blocks of reality and the connections between them. They shouldn't have any like built-in necessities or impossibilities about other building blocks.
Right. It's about the fundamental independence of these basic features of reality.
Okay, I think I'm following. So we've got minimality, we've got non-modality. What's the third constraint?
The third constraint is intrinsicness.
Intrinsicness, okay.
This means that the perfectly natural properties should characterize what a particular is like in and of itself, like independently of the existence or nature of any other particular.
Okay, so it's about what makes something what it is, fundamentally, regardless of its context.
Right. And this leads to the idea of perfect duplicates.
Okay, perfect duplicates.
So two possible objects are perfect duplicates if they share all the same perfectly natural properties.
Okay, got it.
And then a property is intrinsic if and only if any two perfect duplicates either both have it or both lack it.
Okay, so intrinsicness is about what's like essential to an object, what makes it that kind of object, regardless of its relations to other objects.
Yeah, exactly. And the ASEP points out that there's this kind of tight circle between the concepts of intrinsic, perfect duplicate, and perfectly natural.
Oh, interesting.
And philosophers like Lewis himself and Langton have explored ways to kind of break out of this seemingly circular definition.
Okay, so minimality, non-modality, intrinsicness. What's the fourth constraint?
The fourth constraint, and this one at least applies to monadic properties, is empirical determination.
Empirical determination.
Yeah.
Okay.
This means that Lewis thought it should be the role of the empirical sciences, and specifically fundamental physics, to tell us which perfectly natural monadic properties are actually instantiated in our world.
Okay, so physics gets to decide what's fundamentally real, at least when it comes to monadic properties.
Right. Now, philosophy might speculate about other kind of alien natural properties, properties that aren't instantiated in our world, but that could exist in other possible worlds.
Okay, so philosophers can still play around with possibilities.
Yeah, but the special sciences like biology or psychology, they don't get to dictate what's fundamental at this level.
Got it. Okay, so those are the four constraints for monadic properties. What about for relations? Are they the same?
So the SEP says things are a little less straightforward with relations. Lewis definitely thought that spatiotemporal relations, like being a certain distance from or being earlier than, are perfectly natural. But, could future developments in physics lead us to change our minds about that? It's an open question. Now, almost Lewis, in his simplified picture, he adds a fifth constraint,
Okay.
which Lewis himself ultimately rejects.
Okay.
And that constraint is that only spatiotemporal relations are perfectly natural, and in fact, they're the only possible relations.
Wow, okay. That's a strong claim.
Very strong. But again, Lewis doesn't actually endorse that view.
Okay, good to know. So let's move on to the second key question that the SEPI raises about Almost Lewis's position. What does it mean to say that the fundamental particulars are space-time points?
Right, so the SEP clarifies that for Almost Lewis, saying that the fundamental entities are space-time points means primarily that they stand in those perfectly natural spatiotemporal relations to one another. It's their participation in those fundamental spatial and temporal relationships that makes them located in a space-time framework.
Okay.
And it's the relations that are fundamental, not so much some intrinsic property of being a space-time point.
Okay, so it's the network of relations that defines their place in reality. What about the third question? What does it mean to say that they are space-time points?
Right, so to say they are space-time points means they're simple, they have no parts, they're fundamental in that sense.
Okay. At the level of particulars, they're the indivisible building blocks. So to put it all together, the initial statement of Almost Lewis's ontology needs a bit of refinement.
It does.
How does it get revised?
Okay, so the revised picture is this. There are particulars, and these particulars are either simples or they are entirely composed of simples. These simples have various perfectly natural properties. They stand in a variety of perfectly natural spatiotemporal relations to each other, and that's all.
Wow, okay. So we've got simples with fundamental qualities interacting through fundamental spatiotemporal connections.
That's it. That's the complete inventory of fundamental reality according to Almost Lewis.
It's a strikingly minimalist picture.
It is.
Now, the fourth question is, what's the relationship between this ontology and Lewis's super famous and often debated thesis of Humean supervenience?
So the SAP emphasizes that there's a very close relationship between the two, although they're not strictly identical. A typical formulation of Humean supervenience, or HS, which is actually a bit stronger than the version that Lewis himself endorsed, states that no two possible worlds differ with respect to what is true at them without differing with respect to the geometrical arrangement of their spacetime points, or with respect to which perfectly natural properties are instantiated at those points.
Okay, so any difference between two possible worlds has to come down to a difference in how the fundamental building blocks are arranged, or what their fundamental qualities are.
Exactly. It's a powerful claim about the basis of all possibility.
It really is.
So stated like that, HS is a supervenience thesis.
Supervenous.
It means that all higher-level facts logically depend on those fundamental low-level facts. Now, this is logically weaker than almost Lewis's stronger claim of reduction.
Okay, so remind us what the difference is between supervenience and reduction.
Sure. So supervenience just means that if you fix the facts at the lower level, you automatically fix the facts at the higher level.
Okay.
Reduction is stronger. It says that the higher level facts are fully explained by the lower level facts. Like they're nothing over and above the lower level facts.
Okay, so almost Lewis is committed to reduction.
Yes.
HS is just supervenience.
Right. And this strong version of HS is typically considered to be necessarily true.
Mm.
However, Lewis himself accepted a weaker, contingent form of HS.
Okay, so what does that mean that it's contingent?
It means that it could have been false.
Okay.
There might be other possible worlds where HS doesn't hold, but we'll touch on those reasons a bit later.
Right. And the key difference here is that HS by itself doesn't say anything about the nature of possible worlds themselves. Whereas almost Lewis and Lewis explicitly want to reduce facts about possible worlds to facts about their fundamental ontology.
Right. For Lewis, possible worlds are just different arrangements of these same fundamental elements.
Okay. So HS is compatible with different views about what possible worlds are.
Exactly.
Whereas Lewis has a very specific view that they're just made up of this fundamental stuff arranged in different ways.
Right. And the SAP also points out that almost Lewis's position, which includes modal realism, actually entails HS.
Okay.
So any philosophical objections to HS are also objections to almost Lewis.
Right, because if almost Lewis is true, then HS has to be true too.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got a good handle on the almost Lewis framework. Now, where does the actual Lewis diverge from this simplified picture?
Okay, so there are four main points of divergence that the SCP highlights. The first one is that, as we mentioned earlier, Lewis took quantum physics seriously.
Okay.
He didn't endorse that strict claim that only spatiotemporal relations are perfectly natural.
Right, because quantum physics might involve other kinds of fundamental relations.
Exactly. He was open to that possibility.
Yeah.
The second point of divergence is that Lewis was agnostic about whether there might be fundamental entities that occupy space-time points rather than being the points themselves.
Okay, so instead of the point itself being the fundamental thing, there might be something even more fundamental that is located at that point.
Right. But the Sepia author actually finds this agnosticism pretty problematic.
Yeah, it does seem kind of weird. Like, if the fundamental entities are defined by their spatiotemporal relations, what would it even mean for something else to occupy those relational nodes?
It's a tough one to wrap your head around. The third point of divergence is that almost Lewis is committed to everything being composed of simples, but Lewis himself was actually agnostic about the possibility of gunk.
Gunk, okay.
Yeah, so gunk is this philosophical idea that everything is infinitely divisible. So every part has a proper part, and there are no fundamental simples.
Okay, so it's like you can keep zooming in forever, and you never reach a bottom level.
Right. And Lewis considered this a genuine epistemic possibility, but the SEP suggests that we can kind of set it aside for simplicity's sake.
Okay, good.
And the fourth point of divergence is that Lewis thought that Humean supervenience, even in its weaker form, is at best contingently true.
Okay.
And this contrasts with the view that HS, as we formulated it earlier, is necessarily true.
Right, and that's a view that's more in line with the stricter ontology of almost Lewis.
Exactly. But the SAP also notes that Lewis's arguments for the contingency of HS weren't super convincing.
Okay, so Lewis's view is a bit more open-ended.
It is.
It allows for some possibilities that almost Lewis rules out.
Right.
Now, I think it's safe to say that no philosophical system, especially one as comprehensive as Lewis's, is without its critics.